It is the Beaver Banter podcast. I'm CJ Baumgartner with my co-host Ian Rivers, and we're getting ready to record here, Ian, for this latest podcast. Still a blanket of snow. I can't even imagine what it's like up in Bemidji right now outside. But we're going to try and record a podcast talking a little bit about some spring-related sports and maybe even touch on hockey since we're in the mood. One thing, we talked about this before we started recording, Ian. My microphone situation is a little wonky, so if I sound really echoey because I'm recording currently at my parents' house, that would explain it. So bear with me on that one, but we should be ready to go. Ian, a great hockey weather outside for March 22nd.
Yeah, it's actually not that bad down here in central Minnesota, but I know that up in Bemidji they were supposed to get 4 to 6 inches overnight, and I'm sure that it's not very pleasant. And I know that the northern parts of the state have been getting hit a lot harder than we have, but yeah, definitely hockey weather. Men's tournament's going to start up here. Obviously, it's unfortunate the Beavers are not in it, but we've talked about Beavers hockey a lot, and I think everybody understands why we are not playing at this point in the season. The difficult part is swallowing the fact that Harvard is a choke artist, and they did not allow the University of Alaska Fairbanks into the tournament for us. So thank the smarty
Just can't trust
pants.
those nerds.
Yeah, the Harvard Crimson for getting into the tournament and leaving Alaska one spot short. And that's the deal with the pairwise. It's like, well, man, I've seen people complain like, oh, the pairwise should just screw it and let Alaska in anyways. And it's kind of the give and take because with basketball and football, right, you've got a committee that just says, yeah, this is the fourth best team in the country. We're going to put them in. And they could have chosen the Minnesota Golden Gophers and been like, here's our reasoning for it, even though they were in a 3-loss team. And everybody be like, what? Why would you do that?
They could choose the Bemidji State Beavers for all they wanted to.
Exactly. And so that's the kind of nice thing about college hockey is the pairwise gives you the transparency beforehand. You know what you need to do. You know what needs to happen for you to get in. And it does make the selection show a little bit less exciting. But you still, it's mostly just for figuring out where people are playing. And that's what I kind of was involved in over the last couple of days. I've been getting some one of my TikTok videos actually reached the Twitter sphere. Ohio State fans are apparently not very happy with me slandering their hockey team. But yeah, I think it's a little bit weird how they set up the tournament this year. The Fargo regional is basically Minnesota teams and then Canisius. I don't know, because in a typical tournament, you would see like in a 16 teams, you'd have the 1 versus the 16, which you have with the Gophers and Canisius, and then you have the 6 versus the 11 in that same regional when you would normally see the 8 versus the 9. But most tournaments, there's the rule you can't play a conference opponent in the first game of the tournament. They try to delay that as much as possible, and so the 8 and the 9 were, I believe, Penn State and Ohio State. So they had to separate those two. And then the other thing that they do, which I think is a bit silly, is allowing teams to host regionals when you only host, like, there's only like 8 towns that get the regionals every year. And there's probably more that goes into it. Like, those are probably the towns that actually like throw money at the event and actually have fans that come out. And there's more to it than that. But I think it's unfair to let North Dakota and Penn State host regionals and get to go and play home games in the playoffs when like a team like Northern Michigan would never get the opportunity to host, and Bemidji would never get the opportunity to host a regional because they just, not that Bemidji maybe doesn't have the facilities for it, but a 5,000 capacity arena probably isn't what they're looking for in terms of a regional site to host a game at. So I thought that was unfair. And so you're forcing Penn State now to not play in Fargo because they host Allentown. So they have to be there. So that means that the Gophers have to play against the number 6 seed if everything goes chalk, or get this, they get the Mavericks, who have been a thorn in their side in the past 2 tournaments. So there's weird hoops that the NCAA has to jump through. It's mostly for attendance, stuff like that, but it should be a pretty good tournament. Most of the games, there's a couple good games. I think Michigan Tech and Penn State I'm really excited for. We've been obviously following Michigan Tech pretty closely with this podcast all season. Mankato and St. Cloud State is probably going to be a really good game. And then the one that I'm really excited for is Boston University in Western Michigan, because I think that would be a lot closer game if it was not in Massachusetts. I think that gives Boston U a pretty big advantage over the Broncos. But I mean, I don't know, man. I'm headed up to Fargo. Actually, I leave tomorrow morning. I gained some tickets, just like I know a couple of the listeners of our show did. And we're gonna go up and we're gonna watch some hockey. The Minnesota Regional, it might as well be called. Um, and I know that there are some frustrated Maverick fans because tickets just aren't available. You know, this regional was sold out um before the teams were even decided who was going there. And now the UND fans that purchased it, assuming that their team would find a way to sneak into the playoffs, which they almost did, they're not selling their tickets, or if they are, it's at an extremely high price. And so Maverick fans can't get tickets to the regional because there's none available. So it's just going to be, it's always a weird demographic because you're going to have Gophers fans that had already kind of purchased their tickets in advance, assuming that they would get the number one overall seed. And then you're going to have North Dakota fans that are wearing any jersey other than a maroon one, I'm sure. It's going to be a weird demographic of fans there, but I'm sure it will make for exciting hockey overall. And hopefully the Beavers can work their way in to the tournament in future years.
Well, and so this brings up an interesting question with and you've answered it a little bit already, but it's been something. If you look at the comment section of the NCAA Twitter page when they released the bracket, flooded with Minnesota, and not just necessarily the University of Minnesota, but Minnesota hockey fans who reside in the state of Minnesota, just tweeting the East Coast bias. For people listening, what do they mean when they say East Coast bias, and is there any truth to that? Because would the NCAA have set up a college hockey tournament where all the Massachusetts schools is set up the way that the Minnesota schools?
Well, I think they try as hard as they can to make sure that nobody has to fly a specific amount of miles. That's what people have been saying. And then you look at a team like Denver, who has to go to Massachusetts this weekend. So if that was true, Denver would be going to Fargo. But I do think there's definitely something to say, and they don't hide it well if there is any East Coast bias, because I think they're truly sick of Minnesota getting 3 teams into the Frozen Four every year, or at least 2, because last year it was 2, the year before it was 3, and this year they have 3 teams in the tournament again, and all of them are playing particularly well right now. The Mavs won their conference tournament, St. Cloud State won theirs, and Minnesota was 1 goal down on Michigan, and they nearly won their conference tournament, and they were one of the most dominant teams in the country this year. So I think they're trying to avoid having all 3 Minnesota teams make a run again. And to that, my argument would be, like, why don't the schools out east just try and get better? You know, like, why is it on the committee to try and prevent something like that? Why can't it be those teams just don't get? Because now you set up all those Minnesota schools in kind of a gauntlet of a regional, and you've got Michigan and Quinnipiac that are kind of just walking to the Frozen Four. You know, if you're just looking at it from a pure skill level, they have probably the 2 easier regionals compared to Minnesota and Boston University, or Denver, I should say, is the number 1 seed in that region. So Denver, BU, Western Michigan, and Cornell. That's quite a difficult region as well. And so I think the one thing you have to look at is just how many times they put regionals. Like this year, the Midwest Regional is in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Allentown is like basically New Jersey, and that is not the Midwest at all. So, like, I think the bare minimum is Ohio if you're trying to decide where the Midwest cuts off, right? It's not Pennsylvania, it's Ohio. And so if you're going to have one in Columbus or Cincinnati like they've done in the past, that's fine and that's fair to me. But every year you look at it and it's like pretty much a 50-50 split. Last year, I believe there was actually 10 teams, or 9 or 10 from the Western portion, what I consider to be the Western portion of college hockey, between the Notre Dames, Minnesota schools, Michigan schools, Denver, North Dakota, Omaha was in it last year, I believe. And so there's a bunch of schools out west, and they're not getting fair representation when you're putting a Midwest regional out in Eastern Pennsylvania. No wonder you have to shove all the Minnesota schools into one region, because you don't give them an opportunity to have a short flight to the actual Midwest. You know what I mean? That's I think the thing that and like I talked about earlier, there's a lot more that goes into selecting a site for a regional, the money that gets thrown at it, whatever schools are willing to host. But I still think at the end of the day, you kind of have to say, like, why doesn't Grand Rapids, Michigan get the Midwest regional? You know, if you want to put the West regional in Fargo, give Cincinnati. I've seen Sioux Falls get the West regional before. They have it out in Loveland every once and then. Why doesn't St. Paul get another crack at it, or Detroit? I know that Illinois doesn't have a college hockey team at the moment, but put one in Chicago like that. Sioux Falls didn't have a D1 team the last time they got a regional, so why not? I think that's the biggest thing to me, is just the East Coast. They seem to cater the flights and make sure that everybody on the East Coast definitely gets catered to, at least this year, because like we said in the past, Bemidji State was, a win away from making it 4 out of 4 teams from Minnesota in the Frozen Four just a couple years ago. So it's not like they do that every year. But I do think this year in particular, they could have done a better job of not, because both Minnesota and St. Cloud State now should be upset, because if the bracket goes chalk, Minnesota now has a harder opponent in the second round than they should. And so does St. Cloud State. St. Cloud State should be playing Michigan, who, for all intents and purposes, is my second best team in the country. So it's not like it's a huge step down from the Gophers, and we just saw them beat the Gophers. But I don't know. It just seems like it's a little bit weird to put the 1 with the 6 this year. And that's really what's got people upset, because I know that Minnesotans, they like the especially like a Beavers fan or somebody who doesn't really have a strong hatred or dislike of any of the other Minnesota schools. They kind of want that. They're like, oh, look at all the Minnesota teams. Like, we're the state of hockey that are in the Frozen Four. And so to take that away and to say that there's no chance of that happening and you're maximum going to get 1 when the bracket really shouldn't have been set up that way, I think is what got people so upset this year.
Yeah, and I think anytime you tell Midwesterners that there's an East Coast bias, I think they'll generally believe you. And I think that there's we're from the Midwest. We don't like those showboaters out there, out on the East Coast there. But anyway, that's the general sentiment of, like, you just feel like they're the best hockey, at least in terms of Minnesotans, will say, that is in Minnesota and the Dakotas and this general area, not so much in the East Coast. But anyway, I digress. Ian, anything else with the men's hockey tournament, with the kind of opening week matches set to be played kind of in the coming days here? Anything else you want to touch on with this tournament? And if not, just who's your Frozen Four picks?
Well, I did make my Frozen Four picks over on my TikTok page. That's Sports Talk Unlimited. For anybody, I think most of the people that listen to the show that would care actually do follow me already. But for those of you that don't know, Minnesota, I have coming out of the Fargo Regional. It's with no confidence at all. They typically do not fare well against other Minnesota teams, especially in the postseason. But I think this team is a little different. I got Minnesota. I have Boston University, just the hometown advantage there in Massachusetts, I think will be enough to get them through Denver. And then Michigan, I think, I have Michigan Tech upsetting Penn State, but I don't think that their team is good enough to compete with all the NHL talent on that roster. So I have Michigan coming out of Allentown, and then I have Harvard upsetting Quinnipiac and getting through in the Connecticut Regional. So Minnesota, Michigan, Boston University, and Harvard are my 4 picks to make the Frozen Four.
Yeah, it's a way to it's and where's the Frozen Four at this year, by the way?
It's in a big college hockey hub, which is Tampa, Florida.
Of course. How could we forget? Because as we learned with the NCAA, here's a shock that a lot of it comes down to money.
I don't even hate the Frozen Four being at Tampa as much as I've seen some people do it. It's like, yes, it doesn't have a college hockey. Like, there's no college hockey teams, especially with Alabama. There's none even down south other than like Arizona State, and that's Southwest, not Southeast. And so I do understand that, but I still think at the same time, for a lot of these guys that have been dealing with Minnesota winters, Massachusetts winters, Connecticut winters, whoever makes the tournament, those teams are mostly northern teams, and it's probably pretty cool to go get to at least go down to Tampa for probably 5 or 6 days, however long they're down there.
Yeah.
And a lot of people probably treat it like a vacation. I know that North Dakota fans, if they were in it, the last time it was in Tampa, North Dakota won, and they had tons of fans there. Guess what?
It's a
They
good
don't care where
incentive
it
to get
is.
Midwesterners to buy tickets and hop down there.
Exactly. So I don't even hate it being in Tampa as much as, I think the Frozen Four is a little bit whatever city wants to host it. Feel free. I don't think you're going to find, unless you're going out west and having it in like Portland, Oregon or something, where there's literally no college hockey teams anywhere near that. And it's not that cold, not that warm in early April yet.
You're going to do it at like the T-Mobile Center in Vegas or something.
Yeah. But I think for the most part, I don't have an issue with Tampa.
All right. One thing we talk about the NCAA being on top of their game. I'm looking at the official bracket. So this is from the NCAA's website off of Google Images. You search NCAA men's bracket. If you look at the first round matchup, it will tell you where everybody's being played, what's going on. But if you look at the second round, it tells you where the games are being played. And if you look at the Fargo one, it says it's being played in the Shells Arena. It's spelled SHEELS Arena. Shells, not Shields, not Shields. The Shells Arena.
Nice.
That's not even to dogpile on them. I just noticed that, and I'm like, well, this goes along great with our East Coast bias narrative. Anyway, so yeah, that's good times had by all. So let's talk a little bit about the women's tournament because that happened. The Frozen Four happened over the weekend, and look away, Gopher fans. Not a great weekend for you. Great weekend for the WCHA as a whole for women's hockey because it was an Ohio State-Wisconsin national championship game, and it was the Badgers coming away with the win, and they're the women's national champions. And, of course, Bemidji State got to experience why both teams are very good, getting their lunch taken to them, let's say, by those other schools. Anything stand out to you from the women's bracket, Ian?
Yeah, I don't think it was. Well, I do think it was a little shocking. Wisconsin would have been my fourth favorite team out of the four that made the Frozen Four if I had to pick them. I'm a little shocked Northeastern kind of got rolled up on by Ohio State as well as they did. But yeah, the three WCHA teams that were in the Frozen Four seemed to fare the best. Ohio State kind of clubbing Northeastern, and then an overtime game between Minnesota and Wisconsin, and then Wisconsin coming out, and I think that was Ohio State's first goalless game on the season was in the national championship game. And so was credit to Wisconsin. They were kind of the third dog in the pack all year. We were watching the race off and on. We weren't really paying too close attention to the top, more of the bottom here on this show of the standings. But yeah, Wisconsin coming out of nowhere, not nowhere, because they're still like a top 5 team in the country. But in some of these sports, when you're talking about the difference between the 1 and the 2 and the 5, it's a little bit different. And so I was shocked to see them go through both Minnesota and Ohio State to get that national championship.
Yeah, as we learn in college hockey, anybody can beat anybody on a given day, and especially when you have the goalie rocking. Like Wisconsin was able to do in that situation. So, I mean, yeah, college hockey, it's going to be a good, fun weekend for the men's tournament as that gets going, and the women's season just wrapped up as well. And for Bemidji State women's hockey, there's nowhere to go but up in that department. So for Bemidji State men's hockey, there's been a couple headlines over the last week. Ian, talking a little bit about Elias Rosen. What do you have on that?
Yeah, Elias Rosen finally signed a pro contract. He got an ATO, which is an amateur trial contract with the Kansas City Mavericks. And then I think 2 games later, he did end up signing a full contract with them. I think what Lucas was talking about on Twitter, how he may end up playing here in the States for the rest of this season, kind of. And then maybe expect him to look for a contract overseas. Of course, he's from, Europe. And so that's something to keep an eye on. But I have no surprise that he's found a home with a pro team with Kansas City so far. And he seemed to play pretty well. I know he got a point in his first game. So congratulations to him. And I guess that just puts a for sure bow on the fact that he will not be returning to Bemidji State. I think we already kind of knew that. But the longer he held out signing that contract, the more hope crept maybe into the back of our minds that maybe there was something on his mind for next season, but not the case. And then the only other hockey news for the conference that I had is something that Lucas tweeted out this morning, and that's um, forward Joey Larson of the Northern Michigan Wildcats is planning on transferring out of their program. So
Interesting.
that's a pretty big blow to their offense. And based on what Lucas said on Twitter, it seems like he may end up signing with a Big Ten team in the future, maybe coming close to home here in southern Minnesota or central Minnesota in the cities. So we'll see. We'll keep an eye on that. But obviously, it'd be kind of nice to have him out of the CCHA and maybe curb some of that Northern Michigan magic because man, oh my God, I thought they were going to the tournament, man. They were this close. And then like I've talked about the Mavericks, they've got a rabbit's foot somewhere, and 2 goals in the last like minute and a half of that game to tie it, and then the overtime winner. Northern Michigan was so close to keeping them out of the tournament, and they just couldn't do it.
Well, for Mankato, it's always like The Simpsons. It's always coming up Millhouse, and it's always coming up Mankato. That's always kind of what it feels like, especially in this conference. And with the Northern Michigan transfer, it kind of goes to show you how we talk about as Beaver fans all the time about, we get a good player. How is this going to affect? Are they just going to transfer out right away? Like, oh my gosh, the transfer portal could really impact. And we kind of get tunnel vision and just think about Bemidji State and not realize. And it's probably not good for the overall benefit of college hockey, especially for the smaller schools, but it also can impact other teams. So you have a team like Northern Michigan that had a great season and had some core building blocks, and one of your best scorers jets off for the Big Ten because he realizes, oh, hey, I had a great year. Now I'm going to go to the Big Ten or one or two top college hockey conferences and elevate my game that way. And it's an addition for the Beavers by subtractions for another team. So that's another interesting kind of landscape in college hockey. Is not only does it affect Bemidji State, the transfer portal, but it does affect some of the other CCHA teams as well, the same way it impacts Bemidji State. Ian, is there any word on anybody who's transferred out of the program for Bemidji State? I haven't really heard anything or seen anything on Twitter.
Nope, I don't believe we have had any news of anybody transferring in or out yet. I'm sure we would see that. I'm sure Lucas would be the first one to let everybody know in the Beavers Twitter sphere. But yeah, I mean Larson, and the difference between like a guy like Joey Larson and maybe Leighton Road for the Beavers is that Leighton kind of came in under the radar. He wasn't really a guy that we even knew about. Um, before the season started as somebody who might break out. And I think Joey Larson was selected to be the freshman of the year, at least the freshman forward of the year in the CCHA. So I could be wrong on that, but I'm 98% sure that he was selected to be freshman of the year when he came in. So, he had these high expectations. And then when he did live up to it, now he's thinking, man, this is as good a chance as I'm going to get to maybe go to a bigger program. So, and he'll definitely find a landing spot, even if it's not somewhere maybe that he's eyeballing. And I know that if it is, the Gophers, who have kind of been the one team that I've for sure been hinted at, is they might be losing about 140 plus points of offense if their top 4 offensive players end up jettisoning for the NHL, like it is maybe expected, depending on how the season ends for them, maybe. For sure, probably Matthew Nyes, who already came back for another year, who wasn't expected to, will be gone. So the Gophers, they have so much turnover every year at the top end that Larson might be a guy that they look for in the transfer portal, and he might fit in really well there. But yeah, no news for Bemidji State so far, and I guess that's probably the best news because I think we have a decently sized recruiting class coming in anyways, so it's not like we need somebody to transfer in. But I think the better thing is that nobody is necessarily transferring out right now. And obviously there's still plenty of time. The season isn't even technically over yet. So, and the transfer portal, I believe, just opened Monday, if I have that correctly.
Yeah,
So
fairly recently. And you got to assume that if anybody's leaving Bemidji State of note, that is happening right away. So if you kind of escape that initial first wave of the transfer portal, I think Bemidji State will be all right. Because if you are a highly sought after player, you're going to want to get out onto the transfer portal as fast as you can before the other bigger schools fill up a need that they could potentially have for you. So anyway, that's kind of our hockey talk here. Ian, let's think spring just a little bit with women's soccer. They have some spring practices. Now, they, of course, are playing their NCAA tournament games at the Chet in a bunch of snow, and now they'll be playing spring games out on the Chet in a bunch of snow. So, Ian, what do you have for them?
well, only one of the four announced spring games will be at the Chet, actually. Two of them coming up this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, will be in Manitoba or in Winnipeg, Manitoba, against the University of Manitoba. So that's Saturday and Sunday in Canada. And then April 1st, they come to Bemidji and they play the University from Grand Forks, North Dakota. And then on April 16th, they go to Duluth and they play the Bulldogs. So four games, spring games for the Beavers women's soccer program. And I think it's a good it'll be a good barometer, playing another Division I opponent. We beat North Dakota, I think 2 years ago now, 2 seasons ago, it should be noted. And then, of course, this year, I believe when we played South Dakota State, we ended up losing, but we did beat a Division I program a couple years ago. So we'll see. It'll be a nice barometer for kind of the new guard without Sarah Wendt and some of these other seniors that left our program in such good graces. So that'll be interesting to follow and interesting to at least get some scores rolling in on that. Hopefully everything goes well. And by April 1st, I would hope that, maybe they get a nice day so that they can play at least a decent game of soccer in Bemidji.
Yeah, it's probably best. Yeah, it's like, all right, man, things are getting a little tough. We got to get out of here. We got to try and play a soccer game. How about we go even further north to Manitoba? Is that something that's in play? That's
Yeah, and we'll
worth
play the
mentioning.
Manitoba games first so that it's even colder.
Exactly. Once we get used to that, then these games back down in Bemidji, down south in Bemidji, really really feel like a heat wave. But yeah, I mean, like you said, there's an old guard of players that left. Sarah Wendt obviously being one of the bigger names in that process, but you don't quite get the incoming freshmen yet, but you do get to see kind of you get to see the first wave of essentially the new players you have coming up and get to see them in their first simulated game action before you take a break for the summer and get ready to come back in August and get ready for the season. But Ian, with now the spring sports, we'll kind of wrap up with here. We were talking before we started recording that it just hasn't been going very well to start the year. And we'll talk about that with Bemidji State baseball. Their rough start to the season continues. They got through the non-conference portion of the schedule and now starting to work their way into a little bit more of the conference games. And currently, if we take a look at Bemidji State's spot in the standings, their record currently, they are 1-19. They are 0-10 on the road. They are 1-9 in neutral site games, and they've lost 6 in a row. And for those of you wondering why we've been waiting to talk so long about the spring sports in this episode, is because, at
You
least
may
for
have
baseball,
just figured out why.
yeah, you may have just figured out why. There's not, here's the thing about this podcast is we want to talk about when the Beavers do well, and we do, I think, do a fair job of saying where they need to improve and things that we feel could be better. But at the same time, I think, what are we supposed to say when they're 1-19? Are we supposed to say that it's been a rough season for them? I mean, it has been. Their pitching has been a point of emphasis that we've talked about, and in the last week, that we've done the podcast in. They've gave up 6 runs in a game. That's not terrible, but 9 runs in a game, 11 runs in a game, 13 runs, and 10 runs. So they've given up 9 runs or more in their last 4 games. That's just, it doesn't matter what your hitting can do, and the hitting hasn't produced a lot of runs either. So I'm not absolving them, but it's like in football, it's really hard to win a game when your defense consistently gives up 45 points a game. It puts way more pressure on your offense to be perfect. And the Bemidji State Beavers just don't quite have the perfect offense right now either. So it's just not it's not a great day to be a Beaver baseball fan right now, which is with the way the season has started.
Yeah, I mean, like we said, what do you want us to say? I mean, if it's the Twins that are out here getting these results, then the Bombs Away podcast is obviously going to be a lot more
Yeah.
animated than we are against, these are kids. They're Division II college players. They're doing what they can out there, and we've already talked about some of the roadblocks that Bemidji State has in terms of spring sports, and they're just playing baseball. So we're not here to harp on them. Obviously,
They haven't been
it's
playing well. They stink, but at the same time, like we're not going to spend the next 10 minutes
yeah,
like
exactly. Exactly. So I think with that being said, moving on to a couple of different sports, at least just touching on tennis, who fell to 2-9 on the season this year or this last weekend with a couple of losses in Duluth against Minnesota Duluth and St. Cloud State. So 2-9 on the season and 1-4 in the conference. Again, not a great start for them, but again, what do you know? What do you know? Tennis, I don't I think I've talked about this in the past. It's like I don't have a huge tennis mind, so I can't really tell you exactly what's going wrong or what they're doing right at the time. But probably the program to be the happiest about so far has been softball.
Yeah.
They have matched their win total from last year. I saw that in the headlines today. Matches win total before NSIC games began. They are 11-11 so far on the season. I think the only concerning thing to me is like when you take a look at these games, the concerning games to me, even though we haven't started conference play, are the games against conference opponents. You look at the two games we played against Concordia St. Paul, for a 4-12 loss, a 2-9 loss, a 13-0 loss against St. Cloud State. Then you go all the way back up to the bubble invite. You lost 5-6 to Mina. Obviously, that's a one-run game that could go either way. But then you have two games in the first 4 games of the season against Duluth. You lose 16-0 and 2-13, and then you have a 3-1 win over St. Cloud State. So you've only won one of those games against teams in your conference. And then I'm sorry, UMary as well. Is in our conference. So they lost that game 8-10. So even with the 11-11 start, which is something definitely better than you would say for baseball to hang your hat on going through non-conference play. It'll be interesting to see how they kind of fare in the conference because we've seen some tough results, and I'm sure Minnesota Duluth might be a pretty good softball team. They seem to have quite a few quality athletic programs there down Highway 2, unfortunately for us. But it'll be interesting to see how they fare. I'm going to keep a close eye on this because I'm hoping that they can have some success and at least, keep their heads above water. But it'll definitely be something to monitor. Those are a little bit of a concerning results there against some of these in-conference opponents.
Yeah, like you said, a little bit of a rough stretch here. The good news for Bemidji State is that they technically don't go against the conference record quite yet, although that'll start a week from yesterday when they play Minnesota Crookston at BSU. It says the BSU softball field, but and who knows if that game will even be played. But again, they can play softball games on the Chet, so we'll see. It with softball, it's more temp. As long as it's warm enough for the bats to be able to be used outside, then they'll end up going out there. But I think with Bemidji State softball, you mentioned it, Ian, of just coming in with the same number of wins as they already had last season before conference play. That's a win for second-year head coach Jordan Peterson. And just for a little bit about her, of course, she followed up Brittany Gomez, who decided to step down from her role as coaching BSU softball. And so Jordan Peterson takes the reins. She's in her second season, a Winona State grad, spent some time bouncing around Northern State, MSUM. So somebody who's fairly familiar with the NSIC softball scene. And again, they went 11-39 the year prior. So it's a very for a second-year coach in the program, essentially still having to build your identity and get your own team in here for the most part. It's a positive sign to see that they've already matched last year's win total before the conference play has officially began.
Yeah, and I think expecting this team to not win another game for the rest of the season is probably more pessimistic than even I am. So I think it's a good start, like you said, for year 2 for Peterson. Definitely hope that this is a sign of better things to come down the road, and that even if this season doesn't end the way you'd like it to, that it's a sign of a building block for the future.
This has been the Beaver Banter Podcast. I'm CJ Baumgartner. That's Ian Rivers. We'll see you guys next week.